Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another evening episode of BNN with Bhante Suddhāso. And this evening, we are going to talk about a really interesting topic, which is the Buddha's advice on politics. But before we do that, we will be chanting the Ratana Sutta as usual, and you can find a link in the live chat. And welcome to Gita, Lilia, Jens, Sally, Gabriella. Hello, Vin. Hello, Bradley, Anumodana, for the beautiful lunch, for feeding the Sangha today. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Hello to Cam. Good to see you. Long time no see. Hello, Gabriella. Hello, James. Hello, Liz. Hello, Marielle, who says, it seems today is all about politics. Listening to the Dhamma from this morning, it was basically about diplomacy. Yeah, non-conflict. It's somewhat true. And she also says, oh, also good evening. And hello, Prikant. Welcome. So I'll pass it on to... Oh, hi, Monica. Good to see you. Hello. Also to Michael.
So good evening, everyone. So as mentioned, we'll start with chanting the Ratana Sutta. So I believe the link has been posted in the live chat, so you can all chant along with us. And we'll start by chanting Namo Tassa 3 times, and then the Ratana Sutta. So please join in as best you can and follow along. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Yani bhutani samagatani bhummani vayani vantaleke sabeva bhuta sumana bhavantu atopi sakata sunantu vasitam tasmahi bhutani sameta sabe metam karota manusiya pajaya Devacharato chaharanti eva linkasmahine rakata apamata Yankinchi vitam idavahuram vasage suvayam ratanam panitam Nano samangati tathagatena idampi buddhe ratanam panitam Vedena sachena suvati hotu Kayam viragam amatam panitam Yadadhaga sakya muni samadhito Natena dhammena samati kinchi Edampi dhamme ratanam panitam Vedena sachena suvati hotu Yang Buddha seto parivanayi suching samadhimanantarikanyamaho Samadhinatena samona vincati dampi dhamme ratanam panitam Vedena sachena suvati hotu Ye bungala tasatam pasata chatari dani yugani honti Te dakineya sugata sasavakai Te sudinnani mahapalani Idampi sanghe ratanam panitam Yetena sachena suvati hotu Yeso payota manasa dalhena Yekamino gotamasasanam hi Te patipata matam vigaiha laddamudanim buddhim punjamanam idampi sanghe ratanam panitam etena sachena suvati hotu yatinda kilo bhatavim sitosi ya chatu vivade via sampakambio Tatupamam sapurisam vadami yo arya sakshani avecha passati idampi sanghe ratanam panitam etena sachena suvati hotu ye arya sakshani vibhavayanti gambhira panyena sudesitani Kinchapi te honti pusapamata na te bhavanga tamanga diyanti idampi sanghe ratanam panitam etena sachena suvati hotu sahava sadasana sampadaya daya sudhamma jahita bhavanti Sakaya deti vichike tancha silampatam vapi yadati kinchi Chatuha paye hichavipamoto chachabhitanani abhambo katum Idampi sanghe ratanam panitam etena sachena suvati hotu Kinchapi sokham mankagroti papakam kayena vacha udaceta Abhambo sodasa patichadaya abhambatadita padasa bhuta Idampi sanghe ratanam panitam etena sachena suvati hotu Vanapagumbe yatha pursitange gimhanamase patamasmin gimhe Tadupamam nammavaranga desai nibbanagamim paramam hitaya Idampi buddhe ratanam panitam etena sachena suvati hotu Varo varanyu varado varaharo anutaro dhammavaram adesai Idampi buddhe ratanam panitam etena sachena suvati hotu Kinam puranam navam nati sambhavam girata citta ayatike bhavasmim Te kina bija viruddhin chanda nirbanti dhira yatayam paripo Idampi sanghe ratanam panitam etena sachena suvati hotu Yani bhutani samagatani bhummani vayani vahantaleke Tathagatam deva manusapujitam buddham namasama suvati hotu Yani bhutani samagatani bhummani vayani vahantaleke Tathagatam deva manusapujitam dhammam namasama suvati hotu Yani bhutani samagatani bhummani vayani vahantaleke Tathagatam deva manusapujitam samham namasama suvati hotu Etena sacha vanjena dukkhavu pasamentu te Etena sacha vanjena vayavu pasamentu te Etena sacha vanjena rogavu pasamentu te. So now we can do a short period of meditation. So Ayasama and I have been doing hard physical work all day, so we'll just sit for a few minutes and then we'll go to the Dhamma talk. So please get in an uncomfortable position. I recommend full lotus. It's especially uncomfortable, though it's also very supportive to meditation practice. I think this is one of the very rare times when Ayasoma did not roll her eyes when I mentioned full lotus, and I think that's because I actually said it's uncomfortable. In fact, she just gave me a little satisfied nod. So I think I've discovered the secret to recommending full lotus. I just have to remind people that it's uncomfortable. However, half lotus is also uncomfortable. Quarter lotus is uncomfortable. Burmese posture is uncomfortable. Kneeling is uncomfortable. Sitting in a chair is uncomfortable. Standing is uncomfortable. Walking is uncomfortable. Lying down is uncomfortable. Everything is uncomfortable.
Where is the dukkha?
Once you get over that, then it becomes comfortable. So get in an uncomfortable position and put your mind in a comfortable position, which is the position of equanimity. Taking a few deep breaths, letting the body and mind relax. Settling the mind into the body. Feeling the body sitting here, solid, heavy, moist, warm, airy, spacious, pervaded by consciousness. Feeling body and the mind. Sitting peacefully on this seat. And feeling a connection with the Buddha, who 2,500 years ago sat underneath the Bodhi tree, body and mind holding still, alert, upright, peaceful. But just by sitting in this way, already we draw a bit closer to the Buddha. Already our affinity with the Buddha grows stronger. And increase the strength of your mindfulness, feeling the body ever more sharply and clearly with each passing moment. Feeling the peacefulness of just sitting here with nothing to do, nothing to think about, nothing to plan, no responsibilities, no duties, nothing to do except just to sit here with alertness and serenity. With a mind like an open sky, with a body like the vast earth. Just relaxing into the peacefulness of sitting, doing nothing, being no one, going nowhere. So peaceful, so soothing, so joyful. Just continually bringing attention to the serenity and peacefulness of sitting quiet and still with nothing to do. Just relaxing into the present moment without letting the mind go dull. Enjoying the peacefulness of doing nothing. Nothing we need to do. No one we need to be. So you can relax. You can adjust your body to another uncomfortable position.
Thank you, Bhante, for guiding us in meditation. And hello, Venerable Ayasudhamma. Good to see you online. Welcome. And welcome to Einat. I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. And Grant, hello. David, and hello, Richard, our dear neighbor. So, without further ado, we also have Cunning Corvid.
Cunning forward.
Yes.
Okay.
Does that mean anything?
No.
Okay.
Not to me, anyway.
All right.
Okay.
I'll pass it on to Bhante.
All right. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So the topic for this evening is wise governance, and in particular what the Buddha had to say about politics and government. And for some reason, this is a surprisingly taboo subject in contemporary Buddhism. And there's a prevailing belief that the Buddha never talked about politics, and that therefore monks should never talk about politics, and that Buddhism has nothing whatsoever to do with politics or with government, and that if anyone dares to suggest otherwise, that this is a terrible tragedy. I have no idea where this viewpoint comes from, because once again, it's not based in the suttas. You're probably used to me saying this by now, because it seems virtually every talk I use the phrase, I don't know where this comes from because it's not from the suttas, because unfortunately, there are in fact a lot of pervasive ideas about Buddhism, which I don't know where they come from because they're not from the suttas. So this is one of those things. So the Buddha actually did, in a number of places in the suttas, talk about politics and talk about government and talk about proper ways to make political decisions, proper ways to govern countries, proper ways to handle political duties, governmental responsibilities, and how to do it in line with Dhamma. And this is quite reasonable because, again, over and over again in the suttas, the Buddha talks about the importance of everything we do being in line with Dhamma. Everything we do should be wholesome. It should be supportive of awakening. It should be based on wisdom and compassion. The Buddha did not say, do everything with wisdom and compassion except politics. He did not say, always do what is wholesome except when it involves government. The Buddha did not say, follow the 5 precepts unless you're the president, or the king, or the prime minister, or whatever it is to you. It doesn't matter. So you don't find these things in the suttas. And also the Buddha doesn't say, do what is wholesome except when voting. Do what is wholesome except when discussing government policies. Do what is wholesome except when choosing what laws you support and which ones you don't. He didn't draw these weird little lines around politics that a lot of contemporary practitioners like to do. It's just not the way the Buddha approached things. Rather, the Buddha approached the Dhamma as something which was, and still is, applicable to every single aspect of our lives, which includes the domain of politics and government. It's not separate from politics and government. So this evening, I picked out a few sutta quotes from 3 different suttas, which illustrate a little bit of what the Buddha had to say about politics and government. And one interesting thing that should be pointed out, by the way, is that there's nowhere in the suttas where the Buddha endorses one particular style of government. The closest he comes is there is one place, and I didn't include this in the sutta quotes I'm going to talk about. There's one place where he praises the Vajji Republic. But interestingly enough, his praise of the Vajji Republic doesn't actually seem to be based on the fact that it's a republic, but rather based upon the respectfulness with which the Vajji Republic was making its decisions and enacting its policies. Rather, the Buddha seemed to be praising the attitude of respect for each other and for the citizens of the Vajji Republic, not necessarily for the Republican form of government itself. Similarly, there's many places in the suttas where the Buddha is interacting with kings and ministers and generals and other government officials at various levels of power, from low levels all the way up to the top of the top. And nowhere does he ever give the impression that he favors one particular style of government over another, or that he considers one particular style of government superior to another. However, he does give quite a bit of advice, regardless of what style of government one is using. He gives quite a bit of advice about how that government should act and behave. And also then, correspondingly, how we who have some influence on government should treat should treat the policies of that government, like what policies we should be trying to uphold and support. So again, keeping in mind, first off, this basic overarching principle of the Dhamma, which is always do what is wholesome, never do what is unwholesome. Always do what brings benefit to self and others, never do what brings harm to self or others. So basic principles of Dhamma, which we see repeated over and over and over throughout the suttas. And again, there's no exception clause for politics. The Buddha didn't say, don't harm others except when it's politically expedient. He did not say, don't harm others except when it's good for the economy. The Buddha just didn't say these sorts of things. You won't find them anywhere in the suttas. Instead, he said, don't harm self or others. Always benefit self and others. This is what we see the Buddha saying over and over and over again. It's unavoidable. It's inescapable. And of course, basic principles of the 5 precepts. So not killing, not stealing, not engaging in sexual misconduct, not telling lies, not using intoxicants, basic principles like that. So again, I'm going to read a few excerpts from the suttas as a starting point for talking about some of the Buddha's attitudes towards government. And then I'll speak a bit about how we can apply that in our own practice. So the first one that I'll post some quotes from is Digha Nikaya number 26, the Chakravarti Sutta. So this sutta is one which goes into some detail about the Chakravarti, which is the universal monarch. And there's a number of suttas which talk about the Chakravarti, the universal monarch. And a Chakravarti is held up as being the example of the ideal monarch, the perfect monarch. So this is the case of what one might call a benevolent dictatorship, benevolent monarchy. Again, often when people talk about the Buddha and governmental forms, there's this focus on the Buddha's praise of the Vajji Republic. But it's actually missing the fact that far more commonly in the suttas, the Buddha praises benevolent monarchy rather than republics. And the example of this is the Chakravarti, the benevolent monarch, the perfect monarch. So here's one case where he talks about the duties of the benevolent monarch, of the noble monarch, of the monarch who rules a country in line with the Dhamma. So the sutta, and the Digha Nikaya suttas, by the way, are really long, so I just picked some excerpts rather than give the whole sutta, because otherwise we would be here for hours. So Digha Nikaya 26, this excerpt says, it has in this case, it's the new king is asking his ministers for advice. So the new king asks, what is the noble duty of a universal monarch? Basically, what is the right way to govern a country? And the ministers reply, relying on the Dhamma, respecting the Dhamma, valuing the Dhamma, honoring the Dhamma, worshiping the Dhamma, revering the Dhamma, led by the Dhamma, illuminated by the Dhamma, ruled by the Dhamma. Based on the Dhamma, you should provide protection for the family members, soldiers, and aristocrats who depend on you, for Brahmin householders, for the people living in both cities and countryside, for contemplatives and priests, and for animals and birds. Do not do anything in the kingdom that is not in accordance with the Dhamma. So this is the first section here. So note here the emphasis placed on the Dhamma, the emphasis placed on doing everything in accordance with Dhamma, of relying on the Dhamma, being guided by the Dhamma, as being the basic principles which one acts upon. So always coming back to the Dhamma. And there's this very strong statement, do not do anything in the kingdom that's not in accordance with Dhamma. So always coming back to those basic principles of Dhamma, of doing no harm and doing as much benefit as possible, of always seeking to uphold what is wholesome and to diminish what is unwholesome. And he gives some specific examples here of providing protection, not just for the people who depend upon him, so his immediate relatives and his supporters, but also for everybody else in the country. So the householders, the people living both in the cities and in the countryside, so not favoring the people who live in the cities or favoring the people who live in the countryside, but equally supporting both of them. And supporting contemplatives and priests, so supporting the religious people in the country, upholding and supporting the religions, so not suppressing religion, not controlling religion, but protecting it, giving it the opportunity to be there as a source of guidance and solace for people. And he also mentions protecting animals and birds, so also providing for animal welfare. So the Buddha specifically mentions here providing for the welfare and fair treatment and kind treatment of animals. So not exempting animals from the protection of law, not exempting animals from the providing of basic rights and dignities. So again, noticing here, in this, he is also emphasizing, so not getting lost in nepotism. So of course, one should provide for one's family members and for one's political supporters, one's political allies, but one also needs to provide for everybody else equally. Also, I find it notable that he emphasizes supporting people who live both in the cities and in the countryside. So one of the divides that sometimes comes up in governance, and this is something that we've seen in this country in recent decades, is this idea that the rural people and the urban people are in opposition. That some policies support people who live in the cities but harm people who live in the countryside. Some policies support people who live in the countryside but harm people who live in the cities. Well, the Buddha is emphasizing that in governing a country, we should always be careful to consider the welfare of both those who live in the cities and those who live in the countryside. So not valuing one over the other. So historically, most people lived in the countryside. And there were small villages scattered all over the place, and a small number of larger towns, and a very small number of larger cities. Very few people lived in cities. Over the past few decades, that's reversed. And these days, most people live in cities, and not so many people live in the countryside. So with that shift, there's come to be an emphasis on urbanites, on city people, and a diminished attention to the welfare of countryside people, of rural people. So that's also something that does need to be paid attention to, that we're considering all the people in the country, all the people and all their different ways of living. We're not neglecting the needs of any particular group. Then he goes into a very interesting statement as well. He says, if there are people in the kingdom who are poor, then give them money. Very simple statement. You got poor people, give them money. So this is something where the Buddha makes a very direct statement. You don't just let the poor people suffer and struggle along. You don't blame the poor people, saying it's their own damn fault. You don't say poor people are lazy. You don't say it's the result of their own bad karma. You help them. You give them some money. You provide them with their basic needs. You make sure they've got enough to get by. You make sure that they're able to live a dignified life. So it's one of the basic principles of governance that the Buddha emphasizes. Give money to the poor. And he says this is something the government should be doing. Of course, all of us should be doing this, but he says this is something that should be coming right from the top of the government, is ensuring money is given to the poor, ensuring that poverty is directly handled by the government through the distribution of funds to those who need it. So here the Buddha he's clearly upholding the principle of social welfare, of universal income. Then he says, if there are contemplatives and priests in the kingdom who refrain from intoxicants, are settled in patience and gentleness, and who tame themselves, pacify themselves, and enlighten themselves, then from time to time you should approach them and ask them questions, such as, Bhante, what is wholesome? What is unwholesome? What is blameworthy? What is blameless? What should be done? What should not be done? What will lead to long-term harm and suffering? What will lead to long-term benefit and happiness? And having listened to them, avoid what is unwholesome and commit to what is wholesome. This is the noble duty of a universal monarch. So here he's also emphasizing that in order to be a good ruler, then you should seek out dedicated, sincere, spiritual contemplatives and practitioners. And from time to time, you should go and ask them questions and listen to them carefully and heed their advice. So not just going on your own gut instinct, not just going on what feels right to you, but rather consulting the spiritual and religious authorities of the land. And that doesn't necessarily mean the archbishops, the administrative people in the church, but rather those who are sincere contemplative practitioners. So the Buddha emphasizes people who, first off, refrain from intoxicants and are settled in patience and gentleness. So people who already have cultivated at least a basic degree of self-restraint and peacefulness within themselves, and who are actively working on taming themselves, so actively working on getting control over their base instincts, pacifying themselves, so actively working on bringing themselves to a deeper state of inner peace, and enlightening themselves, so we're actively working on cultivating wisdom. So he's talking about contemplatives. So again, this is not necessarily the administrative clergy who work in offices, but rather the people who are deeply committed to a personal experience of religious truth. The Buddha is saying those are the people that you should seek out and ask for advice from, and having listened to them, you should heed their advice. Again, this is the advice that's given to the head of state. You'll note here he does not say, follow your conscience. He says, seek out people who actually know what they're talking about and listen to them. And in particular, seek out spiritual contemplatives and listen to them. Then the sutta goes on through a number of iterations of various monarchs who follow this advice and have peaceful kingdoms with lots of prosperity and such. And then it gets to a point later on in the sutta where things start to go a little bit wrong. So I'll read this section. So later in the sutta, then an anointed aristocrat king gathered together the advisors, counselors, clerks, ministers, bodyguards, gatekeepers, and magicians, and asked them about the noble duty of the universal monarch. When asked, they explained to him the noble duty of the universal monarch. Having heard this, he arranged protection based on the Dhamma, but he did not give money to the poor. Because he did not give money to the poor, poverty became prevalent. Once poverty was prevalent, a certain person stole from another. And at this point, the sutta goes on and on and on for quite some length. So here I wrote a brief summary of what happens in the rest of the sutta. So it says, at this point, things degenerate rapidly. Theft becomes increasingly common. The king initially tries to solve the problem by giving money just to the one thief. But others also take up stealing. In other words, the king was like, well, okay, well, this person stole because he was poverty stricken, so I'll give him some money. But there were still lots of other people who were living in poverty. And so lots of other people also got the bright idea of stealing because there was no other option. They were desperate. So other people also start stealing. So then the king decides that he's going to start punishing the thieves with torture, imprisonment, and execution. But that just pisses a bunch of people off, and it still doesn't address the underlying problem of pervasive poverty. So theft becomes increasingly common, and not only does it become more common, but the thieves become increasingly desperate and start engaging in murder. And this sutta continues describing how gradually over time, all morality fades away from the country. The whole fabric of morality fades away, and eventually the society collapses into chaos. And what did this all start from? Because the government was not giving money to the poor. So here the Buddha is emphasizing how important this is. The importance of making sure that everybody in the country is well looked after, well taken care of, that nobody is lacking their basic needs. Everybody is provided for. So giving money to the poor. And also he emphasizes here the connection between poverty and crime. So desperation can turn even the most moral person into a criminal. Because when we have no other options, then we start to consider options that we previously thought were out of bounds. Someone who is starving to death and who sees a loaf of bread will be very tempted to reach out and take it. But if that person has money to buy a loaf of bread, then they'll buy a loaf of bread, and there's no problem. It's a very basic principle. If we address the problem of poverty, then crimes of desperation will stop happening. There might still be other crimes that occur. In fact, there certainly will be. There's lots of rich people who engage in crimes. Some of them even wind up getting elected into government office. But that's another story, of course. That's arising from greed, hatred, and delusion, which is a pervasive problem that affects people at all levels of society. But we can at least take away the problem of crimes of desperation through addressing poverty. The next sutta that I wanted to provide some quotes from is Digha Nikaya number 5, the Kuttadanta Sutta. So in this case, a Brahmin named Kuttadanta comes to ask the Buddha for advice. And in order to give advice, the Buddha tells the story of a past event with a king named Mahavijita. So there's a king named Mahavijita who wanted to have a big religious festival. So he goes to the Brahmin, the head Brahmin, and asks the Brahmin what to do. And of course, religious festivals are very expensive. So the king was thinking about raising taxes in order to pay for the religious festival. And the Brahmin said, "The king's country is full of danger and oppression. There are brigands who prey on villages, towns, cities, and travelers. Honorable king, raising taxes in this dangerous, oppressed country would not be the proper duty of an honorable king." So first just acknowledging this. So this is where there's already the problem of pervasive crime in the country. There's already the problem where there's a lot of poverty, a lot of difficulty going on. So the Brahmin is saying if you raise taxes, it's just going to make the problems worse. There's going to be more poverty because people won't have enough money. There's going to be more crime, and the existing crime is not going to be eliminated. So the Brahmin is saying this really isn't a good idea. You want to raise taxes? Well, right now that's not going to address the basic problem, which is that the people can't survive. With the situation as it currently is, they don't have enough to get by. And there's all this crime in the country, which is making it very dangerous for people to live here. And the Brahmin then says, Honorable king, if you were to think, I will uproot this infestation of brigands using execution, imprisonment, confiscation, censor, or exile, that would not properly uproot the infestation of brigands. Not all of them will be killed, and the survivors will continue harassing the kingdom. So here the advisor is emphasizing the fact that if you try to address the issue of crime through punishment, that will not solve the problem because it's not addressing the underlying issues. So just killing some of the criminals or putting some of them in jail or exiling some of them, that doesn't address the underlying issues that led to the rise of crime in the first place. So it's not going to provide any kind of lasting solution. It might temporarily reduce the numbers a little bit, but in the long term, it's not going to eliminate the basic problem. If you don't address the cause, then the result will keep manifesting. Again, it's like the case of weeds. If you have weeds and you just cut them, well, it looks nice for about 2 days, and then the weed grows back. Doesn't take long because the roots are still there. So it's like in the same way, if you cut down some of the criminals, well, you might get short-term results, but it's not going to address the problem. So then the advisor says, instead, it is by providing that this plague of brigands can be properly uprooted. So the Pali word here is sangvidana, which literally means sharing, providing, distributing. So some translations have sangvidana as meaning arrangement, but that's a bit unusual. It wouldn't quite fit the case here. So sangvidana means, again, it means dividing up and sharing out. So he says, therefore, honorable king, to all the farmers and cattle ranchers in the kingdom, provide seed and fodder. To all the merchants in the kingdom, provide goods. To all the government employees in the kingdom, provide food and salary. As they will be occupied with their work, these people will not harass the king's country, and the king's revenue will be great. The country will be safe, not dangerous or oppressed. People will be joyful, playing with their children, living in open houses. So this was the advice of the king's advisor, was rather than go around executing and imprisoning all the criminals, instead address the underlying causes, which is that people don't have a livelihood. People aren't able to provide for themselves. People don't have constructive, supportive activities to engage in. So build up the infrastructure of society. How? Once again, through social welfare programs. But he's also emphasizing here not just simple welfare in the sense of just giving money to everyone, but rather providing people the means to engage in their livelihood. So to the farmers, you give them seed and fodder, because then they can grow their crops, they can feed their domestic animals, they can continue farming without worry. To the merchants, you give them goods. If a merchant has goods, then they can sell things and trade things. So once again, they can engage in their livelihood without problems. To the government employees, give them food and salary. Make sure that your government people are well taken care of. So what historically has been a cause of corruption in governments is when government employees don't feel like they're being properly paid for. They don't feel like they're getting what they need. So then, once again, even a very honest government official, if they're struggling to provide for their family and the mafia boss comes in and says, well, if you just turn a blind eye to some activities, then I'll make sure your family has enough to eat. Well, that would be awfully tempting, wouldn't it? But if the official already has no trouble providing for his family, well, then it's a lot harder to bribe them. It's a lot harder to corrupt them. Of course, you'll always have some corrupt officials who will take a bribe anyway. But once again, it eliminates desperation as a basis of crime, as a basis of social disorder. And so he says, as they will be occupied with their activities, these people will not harass the country, and the king's revenue will be great. So he's also emphasizing, if you make sure that everybody in the country has their basic needs provided for and a livelihood to engage in of some sort, then you won't have anything to worry about, because they'll all be doing something wholesome and supportive. And also, when the people are well taken care of and making money, then you can tax them. Then the king can get some revenue from them. Then the government can tax people without hurting them. And then the sutta goes on with the king following the advice and it leading to prosperity and the reduction of crime in the country. And the last sutta I want to quote, this is a much shorter quote, is from Majjhima Nikaya 129, the Bala Pandita Sutta. And this is another one which talks about the universal monarch. And there's just one little bit that I want to emphasize here, which is it talks about the conduct of the universal monarch. So the universal monarch would expand his territory. And whenever he acquired a new territory, he would go to the people in that territory and he would tell them, and here I'm quoting the sutta, the universal monarch says this: do not kill living beings. Do not take what is not given. Do not engage in sexual misconduct. Do not tell lies. Do not consume intoxicants. Enjoy what is enjoyed. So wherever he goes, whenever he brings a new territory into his kingdom, he instructs the people to follow the 5 precepts and to appreciate their lives, to enjoy what they have, to appreciate the good things that they have. So follow the 5 precepts and appreciate what you have. Which is, once again, not such a problem if all your basic needs are provided for and taken care of. It's not such a problem if you've got what you need. If you have a livelihood, if you're not living in poverty, if you have access to healthcare, then there's nothing you need to worry about. You can enjoy your life. So this also is emphasizing that one of the duties of government is to teach people morality. One of the duties of government is to make sure that everyone in the country understands the basic principles of morality and of living a happy life based on contentment with what you have, appreciation for what you have. So that's all that I have this evening. So these, again, a few selections of some of the things the Buddha had to say about politics and government. And as you can see, it's all Dhamma. It's all in line with Dhamma. So I hope that this was beneficial and brought some useful reflections up in your mind. And at this time, if there's any questions or comments, we can go ahead and switch to handling whatever's in the live chat. Thank you.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you, Bhante, for that beautiful teaching. It's wonderful to learn about what the Buddha had to say in this particular domain. So there's also a lot of excitement in the live chat. The live chat kind of exploded. So I'm not quite sure how I'm going to find the questions, but I'll try my best. So let me scroll to the top. Lots of approval for everything you said and everything that the Buddha said. Impressed that he also mentioned animals. And this, James says, this is why factory farms are morally wrong, in my opinion. And
yes, I completely agree. Yeah, factory farms are an utter nightmare. The Buddha would not approve.
And hello, Christopher Grimes, watching.
Great.
He says, "Oh my God, universal basic income by the Buddha."
Yeah. It's not a new idea. It's been around for 2,500 years at least.
Also, Jim makes the distinction that universal basic income is not welfare. They're different. Giving money to the poor equals welfare. Giving money to all equals universal basic income.
Okay, yeah, so you're getting into the fine details which escape my particular knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the Buddha did specifically say giving money to the poor. So properly speaking, I guess we should call that welfare.
Yeah. Gabriella says how she works in a daycare that serves low-income community. And it's not the poverty that surprises her, but the apathy and antipathy against the poor is what truly shocks me. I shall agree with that. It's very strongly present in this country, this narrative that normally I was also like a little bit weirded out by that. Then talk about mass incarceration. Okay. Masum says, "Good evening, Bhante. If certain thefts are out of desperation and possible poverty that cannot be helped, why is not stealing one of the precepts? Does this exclude people who are poor out of systemic failures of a government, as you have described?"
Well, because stealing is still unwholesome, it's still morally wrong, it's still bad karma, no matter how we justify it. So you do get into cases of mixed karma. So, for example, a parent who needs to feed their children and can't afford to buy food for them and steals food in order to feed their children. That's an example of mixed karma. They're still performing bad karma by stealing, but they're performing good karma because of their intention to support their children. So that's an example of mixed karma. So stealing is always, always, always bad karma. It's always unwholesome, no matter how good our intentions might be. So the Buddha here is emphasizing, though, that if we don't give people any reason to steal, then most people won't.
And Sally says, "What is Bhante's view on countries that control religion? Will that country impact negatively on individual Buddhism practice? If so, for people who live there, how to reduce the impact and practice, and for them to practice well?"
Yeah, so this is a complicated issue because religions are not universally wholesome. So Buddhism, of course, is a completely wholesome religion. But there's a lot of religions in the world and a lot of religions that have existed throughout human history. And some religious traditions are actually cruelty. Some religious traditions contain extremely unwholesome elements. And some religious traditions even contain elements which are extremely destructive to society. And so those are cases where you do get into a little bit of conflict around the idea of freedom of religion. How far do we let freedom of religion go? So, for example, in this country, human sacrifice is not protected by freedom of religion. Even though there are religions throughout human history which have contained human sacrifice as being an important element of religious practice. Many, many religions have had this. In this country, that is not allowed. No matter what religion you follow, no matter how much you can prove that human sacrifice is part of your religion, it's not allowed. Why is that? Because it is considered that preventing the killing of human beings is more important than religious freedom. So that is where one can make a case for some limitations on religious practice. When a religious practice is clearly unwholesome, clearly destructive, then you can make a case for limiting it. However, if we look at countries these days which limit religious freedom, there's a spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, we have, again, places like most of Europe, the US, Australia, where religious freedom is pretty broad. Again, there's certain things you can't do. You can't sacrifice humans, for example. But you can actually do a lot of things which are extremely unwholesome. So, for example, the practice of torturing chickens, which is practiced in certain religious communities in New York City and elsewhere in the country, perfectly allowed. Horrifying and terribly unwholesome, but legal. But then there's other countries where there is extreme restriction and oppression of religion, such as China, as well as some other countries. And that's actually very harmful. And that's definitely not in line with what the Buddha was talking about. So that's a case where even wholesome religious activity is controlled and restricted by the government. So that's definitely not appropriate. Those are my thoughts.
Right. And James says, points on myself heavily. Sure would be nice if my state gave the state employee raise we were promised all year. Think of where that leads. And then he also has a few questions. How should Buddhists peacefully move a country in the direction of these decisions at a grassroots level? Do the suttas give any advice on social change?
I mean, off the top of my head, I can't really think of anything. I would say for that, you should probably consult experts on politics, on grassroots politics. There's actually a person who, actually, we've had a number of political activists who've been involved with BI over the years. There's one in particular, I'm thinking of Matt, who's done a lot of work with grassroots politics. So I'd recommend getting involved with groups like that, learning what you can from them. And you might also find that there's some non-Dhamma elements in what they do. So try not to get taken in by that. Always keep your focus on Dhamma. And remember that the goal of your political activism is always to uphold principles of Dhamma, so that you don't get lost in the negativity that often accompanies political activism. But yeah, I'm really not the person to ask about how to do those things because I haven't been involved in them. So I recommend consulting those who are experts, those who have experience in the field.
Thank you. And Marielle is saying, so he's talking about conquerors, like keep expanding your power extents, but do not alter the identity of the people in the new land. Do not alter the identity of the people in the new land.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I think in one of the suttas you were talking about him, like
so,
the king expanding.
So that's the case of the universal monarch. So one of the interesting things which the Buddha says about the universal monarch, so this is the perfect benevolent dictator, once again, is that he says the benevolent dictator does not conquer other countries by means of force. Rather, other countries willingly join because they see that the dictator is completely benevolent and that the people in his country are prosperous, that they have the ability to live wonderful, happy lives. So they join because they want to, not because they're forced to through military oppression. And that once those territories join the benevolent monarch's kingdom, then the benevolent monarch teaches them morality and contentment. Okay.
Kind of like Italians want to be ruled by Germany now, by Angela Merkel, because because we have bad politicians. So we want to be ruled by the better ones in Europe. Parenthesis. Okay, got lost in translation. And Cam says, Bhante, thank you for yet again another wonderful teaching from you. If there is another chance, can you teach us about Buddhist-based economic model, if the Buddha said anything at all about it?
Yeah, I can't think of anything off the top of my head where he went into those kinds of things, beyond the sort of things that I've spoken about today. Yeah.
All right, and let me see if there's anything else. Actually, there's a lot. And Jan says, Bhante, can you speak about monastics that run and or hold government positions?
So, what do I have to say about that? Well, first off, I would ask, what are their intentions? If their intentions are pure and wholesome, then if that's what they want to do, I guess it's okay.
As the Dalai Lama would be a typical example.
Yeah, I mean, the Dalai Lama was the ruler of a country before it was attacked by a neighboring country and he was forced to leave. So that's actually a great example of a monk who's a political figure. Yeah, ultimately it depends on what they're doing with it. Depends on what they're doing with that position. That's really what it comes down to. Are they doing what's wholesome and in line with Dhamma for the benefit of others? Then it's okay. If not, well, that's a problem.
Okay. And Lawrence is saying the oldest dated Buddhist writings are the edicts. That's the pronunciation of Ashoka. His edicts reflect governance practices that still apply today. And Grant says, thanks, Bhante. It was nice hearing a sutta-based stance on politics. Politics usually create a lot of emotions and attachments. It's nice to just hear a matter-of-factly stance on it and not an opinion. And Gabriela has a question. As mentioned before, I service low-income communities and have people come in impoverished and desperate. Over time, I begin to feel fatigue from my excess empathy. How do I keep up my compassion intact?
Well, I think that subject, compassion fatigue, is a topic for another talk. So I'll go ahead and write that down as the topic for a talk.
Okay, great. Yeah. So we'll have compassion fatigue. Ooh, what's a lovely name. Very good.
I didn't make it up. Yeah.
Well, Gabriela kind of made it up. And Maya says, what is fascinating and what a lot of people who study this sort of field or who intend to participate in that sort of field is that everything is pretty human. Things have always been the same because we're still human. We're not more advanced from the people who came before us. So perhaps the first step we need to take is to have humility. That's always a very good idea.
Yeah. Also learning from the past. One of the big problems that keeps coming up is this historic myopia of ignoring the past and pretending that the present is somehow radically different from the past. But actually, it's not, because we're still dealing with the same human tendencies, the same greed, hatred, and delusion, the same basic social problems. So very quickly, we forget the lessons of the past. So you can actually see this with the erosion of social welfare systems in this country over the past few decades. So a few decades ago, they finally figured out that social welfare is, surprise, good for the welfare of society. That's the name, social welfare. Over the last few decades, it's eroded and crumbled. And now we're having lots and lots of problems as a result. So it's forgetting the lessons of the past. There's actually a lovely quote. I don't know who said this. Those who do not study the past are doomed to repeat it. Something like that. You know this quote.
Yeah, it's very good. Very Buddhist too.
So yeah, that's actually a really important point. We're dealing with the same issues that the Buddha dealt with 2,500 years ago. kings were saying, oh, we've got a lot of crime, what should we do? And the Buddha's like, oh, that's easy, give money to the poor. And the kings are like, is there another solution? Something else we can do, maybe? Maybe like executing people, would that work? And the Buddha's like, no, give money to the poor. They're like, how about mass incarceration? Would that solve the problem? And the Buddha's like, no, give money to the poor. And it's like, maybe we can just keep out all the people we don't like from the country? The Buddha says, no, give money to the poor. Okay.
Okay, and Gabriella has another question. How do I agitate for the betterment of my community in line with Dhamma when there's very bad people in power and a load of public apathy?
Again, I recommend learning what you can from experienced grassroots activists. I'm not an expert on how to enact political change. My focus is on the Dhamma. So I can tell you the principles of Dhamma, which I hope will guide your political activism, but I cannot tell you how to do political activism. So it's more like if I get in a boat and I say, let's go to the other shore. Well, I'm just telling the direction to go, but I have no idea how to pilot a boat. I'm completely clueless. So if you ask me, well, how do I pilot the boat? I'll be like, I don't know, but I can tell you to go to the other shore.
And James asks another question. Do any suttas talk about special protection for women who are abused? I haven't seen them, but it may exist. Really, anything about helping women in terms of protection interests me.
Well, actually, one example is the sutta quote that I mentioned, but didn't include where the Buddha is praising the Vajji Republic. One thing he specifically mentions is he says that they don't force women against their will. They don't engage in forced marriages or sexual assault against women. That was one thing he specifically mentioned as a praiseworthy quality of the Vajji Republic.
Sadhu.
Yeah.
Masum says, mixed karma. Wow, learning something new every day. Great. Oh, and Einat says, bravo Bhante for taking on such a sensitive topic and navigating it so masterfully. And there's lots of praising comments as well. And Sally says, as Bhante mentioned, some countries that restrict wholesome religion like Buddhism, for people who live there, how to reduce the impact and still be able to practice Buddhism well?
Well, you just do the best you can. So that to some extent, that might mean practicing in secret. And you might have to be careful how you seek out the Dhamma. And you might actually be forced into a certain degree of deception, which is unfortunate, but that's sometimes what the situation demands. So again, an example of this is a friend of ours who, before the pandemic, would come to our programs quite often. She's from a Muslim country, and when she goes back to visit, she has to pretend that she's Muslim. Because if people found out that she was Buddhist, she could go to jail. So she has to pretend that she's Muslim because otherwise bad things happen. So that's unfortunate, but that's a case where you do what you have to do. So it's not ideal. The best thing to do, actually, if you're living in a country that oppresses Buddhism, the best thing to do is to leave. Try to leave the country. One of the nice things about the US, at least up until recently, I don't know if it's still the case, but it used to be that people who are suffering religious oppression can get refugee visas to the US. They can get a long-term stay in the US for that reason. I actually know someone who lives here in the US because of religious oppression in their home country. So again, I don't know if that's still easy to get, but it used to be pretty easy to get. Yeah, so if if it's really obstructing your practice, leave the country. You can try to enact grassroots change, but that can be really dangerous. So like in China, if you try to enact grassroots political change, you quietly disappear and nobody hears from you again. Not particularly safe. Better to just leave the country.
All right. And Chris Grimes says, is there a view on taxes and military?
I mean, beyond what I've spoken about. So there's also a few other suttas where the Buddha roundly condemns military aggression, where the Buddha speaks about the utter despicable nature of warfare. That warfare is not to be engaged in, that it's something which should be avoided. As far as taxation, does the Buddha talk about taxation? Not in great detail, except again, we see here the Buddha placed a huge importance on social welfare and upon not taxing the poor to the point where it causes poverty, but instead to be giving money to the poor so that they don't experience poverty. That's what we see. But he doesn't talk about tax rates anywhere that I'm aware of, except in the general terms like you see in these suttas. So yeah, no military aggression, and don't tax the poverty-stricken people. Don't tax the poor people. That's what we see. Give money to the poor. Don't attack other countries. That's what we see.
And Bradley says, I know in some Buddhist traditions, it's against their precepts to hold office. Are you familiar with that?
I'm actually not quite sure off the top of my head where that comes from. And again, I'm very familiar with the Vinaya, but it might be some obscure thing tucked away in a corner of the Vinaya somewhere. So if somebody knows of a reference for that, I'm interested in seeing it. I mean, it was certainly part of my training to not get involved in government office, but that wasn't much of an issue because I was not remotely interested anyway. Yeah, it might be in the Vinaya somewhere, but if so, it's a minor rule tucked in a corner somewhere. It's not something that holds a central place in the Vinaya.
Right. And Jim says, if it isn't too off topic, how do Theravada monastics relate to the Dalai Lama? When growing up, I always thought he was kind of like the leader of all Buddhists, but I'm not sure if that's the case.
So the Dalai Lama is actually the head of one of the four main sects of Tibetan Buddhism. So he's not the head even of all Tibetan Buddhists, let alone all Buddhists worldwide. So many Theravadan practitioners respect the Dalai Lama and appreciate many of his teachings. Some are not so interested in him, but he's pretty universally respected and liked, even if he's not agreed with on every single point. Yeah.
We like the Dalai Lama.
Yeah, he's a cutie.
Yeah. And
he also has the great quality of being willing to admit his mistakes. So for example, back in the 90s, he made some anti-LGBT statements. And then a few years later, he retracted those statements and said that he was wrong.
Yeah.
So that's actually very admirable that he's willing to admit his mistakes.
Yeah, I agree. One second.
And it's 9 o'clock, so we should aim towards wrapping up. Is that hopeless? Do we have dozens of pages?
We could actually make it. And James says, I'll probably get in trouble for this, but thank you for discussing Buddha Sanders tonight. All right, that's my band hammer. Ha ha ha. And there was lots of people like laughing out loud.
So, of course, I'm not going to endorse any particular political candidate. You're not going to hear that from me, at least not on YouTube. But I will just say, read what's in the suttas and carefully think, what can I do to help get policies like these enacted? And then you'll be living in line with the Dhamma. That's what I'll say.
Actually, I think we're good. Oh, Bradley says, politics nowadays are so cutthroat. It's an uphill battle if you want to remain wholesome. And then he says about the precepts. I'm referring to the Plum Village tradition. They have a modified monastic code.
Yeah, so that's a whole other subject. So the Plum Village tradition has an extensive, actually virtually every monastery, to be honest, has some form of proprietary monastic code. Even the Vinaya monasteries have their own proprietary monastic code. The main difference is that only the Plum Village tradition calls their proprietary version Vinaya. Everybody else just calls it their monastery's proprietary protocols. Yeah, I mean, every monastery has its own particular rules and procedures that are particular to that monastery or that group of monasteries. Yeah, and a lot of places, they clearly say that their monastics should not be involved in politics. But some don't say that, which is why you get some monastics who get involved in politics. Okay, anything else?
Wonderful. Well, there are some people that are suggesting that you run for president, and
Dear
Jim says,
Lord, no, I don't want that.
And Jim says, if he wasn't already a dedicated monk, then I'd fully agree. Or Aya, little heart emoji.
Okay, so something you might not realize is that you have to have a lot of political skills and training in order to be president. So if somebody who has no political experience and no political training gets elected to president, really bad things happen. So no, I should not be president because I don't know the first thing about politics.
And Ethan says, I read the Wheel Turning Monarch Suttas, more of an explanation of how things always naturally decline, and less of a you should govern this way sutta. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, that you're correct in the sense that it illustrates natural decline, but that natural decline is also showing how certain conditions contribute to the spread of immorality. And the spread of immorality is what leads to the collapse of society. So there the Buddha is emphasizing the underlying causes that lead to an eventual collapse of society. But he also shows it doesn't need to be that way. And also in that sutta, after it reaches the nadir, the point where things are really bad, then people start taking on moral principles again. And as people start committing to moral principles again, then gradually society reassembles itself. So that sutta is placing a huge importance on the connection between morality and social order. Yeah.
Great, and I think that's all for tonight. There's lots of excitement in the comments. So thank you so much, Bhante, for your wonderful teachings. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So we'll see you tomorrow for the second part of the sutta on non-conflict, just to keep on with this theme at 8 a.m. with Bhante Suddhāso. So hope to see you then. And then tomorrow evening, we will talk about gender, another hot topic, at 7:30 p.m. All right, see you soon and have a great